Hi everyone, welcome back to another Battlerites video. I'm Chyill and today, let's take a look and learn more about Jade, who is the first champion that you'll probably play as in Battlerite. Jade is a ranged champion who deals very high damage to the enemies from afar with a sniper rifle and 2 revolvers. Being a beginner friendly champion, she is actually quite simple to learn and use because her burst damage is actually quite powerful and she has various escape options to get away from the enemy. And so she's actually a good champion to learn, and I would certainly recommend learning her first, especially if you're new to the game. And so before we get to the good stuff, I just want to say that I have split the guide up into different sections and I'll quickly go through them now. We will first take a look at her abilities one by one before moving on to covering her playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Once that is done, we will cover her Battlerites options and then finally finishing off with some of my gameplay tips and also some potential combos with Jade. There will be timestamps included in the description below that you can click on to jump straight to specific sections of the guide. For those of you who are rewatching this or already know her abilities and just want to skip straight to a certain section, feel free to skip ahead and continue watching from there. And so without further ado, let's begin. First off, let's talk about her abilities. Her left click ability is Revolver Shot, and this is her basic attack that you will mostly use while running around, waiting for your cooldowns to reset, or maybe while trying to avoid enemy abilities and doing some damage to them at the same time. There are 6 rounds of ammo in your revolvers which will automatically reload, and you will not be able to fire during that relatively short reload time, but that's okay, it's actually very short. Do be careful though if you try to shoot while trying to avoid enemy abilities at the same time, because you actually reduce your movement speed while you're shooting and moving at the same time. Next up, her right click ability is Snipe, and this is her main damaging ability. Most of your damage on your enemies will come from this ability, and so it is very important when learning Jade to get used to aiming and hitting enemies with this ability. Snipe has a fairly long cast time, but the range of it is quite large, and when it does fire and hits the enemy, it deals like a massive amount of damage, gets you lots of energy and stuns them for 0.5 seconds, and so that's why it is such a crucial ability for Jade. Moving on, her spacebar ability is Blast Warp, and this is, I believe, her primary escape ability, occasional initiating ability and evasion ability as well. The amount of versatility that this ability offers is just crazy. Using this ability inflicts a short stun on enemies around you, just as you jump a certain distance away while avoiding all damage when jumping. I'll go into more detail on the amount of versatility and utility that comes from this ability in the later section. Her Q ability is Stealth, and this is her other escape or initiation ability in her base toolkit, and the ability simply makes Jade invisible for some time while also increasing her movement speed by a bit, allowing her to reposition herself properly. Still do be careful though when you use this skill, because you can still get damaged by enemy abilities, and so you still have to avoid their AoEs and skill shots while in stealth. Next, Disabling Shot is her E ability, and this is her primary interrupt ability. Its function is, well, simply to interrupt an enemy's ability, but it has an added bonus of snaring, as well as silencing the enemy for a short duration, and this may be handy in certain situations. So those were all of Jade's abilities that doesn't cost any energy, and now we move on to the rest of her abilities that actually does cost energy, including her EX abilities. Jade's R ability is Junk Shot, and this is a knockback ability. It costs about 25 energy, but it deals some decent damage and actually knocks the enemy back. Generally, this is an ability that I don't use as often because the knockback doesn't really knock the enemy back very far at all, but it has some uses, but I'll go through that later in the video. The F ability is the ultimate ability for all champions by default, and Jade's is called Explosive Shells. Her ultimate ability essentially allows her to channel and shoot 4 rounds over 2 seconds that deals massive damage to the target as well as the surrounding area around him at the cost of 100 energy as usual. The ability is especially good when your enemies have expended their escape cooldowns, as this means that they cannot easily avoid your ultimate ability. But being a channeling ability, Jade is also vulnerable when using the ability, since she can easily be interrupted or dealt with as she is a stationary target. Finally, her EX abilities. Her first EX ability is Snapshot, and it modifies her right click ability Snipe. So you need to press shift and right click to cast the ability, or if you prefer, pressing the number 1 button will work too. If you've watched my beginner tips video, you would have seen this ability in action before, and basically what the ability does is that Jade will quickly take her sniper rifle and fire a round, and that roots enemies in place for some time while dealing moderate damage to them if they get hit. keep in mind that this ability costs 25 energy, and this ability, as with all EX abilities, share a cooldown with their corresponding base ability, and in this case would be Jade's right click ability. Last but not least is her second EX ability, Smoke Veil. Pressing Shift Q or the number 2 button on your keyboard will activate this ability, and it is basically an upgraded version of stealth which costs 25 energy, and that is really helpful when trying to escape. Instead of just stealthing yourself with Q, the Shift Q ability actually allows you to turn yourself, as well as allies around you, immaterial. And that means you and your nearby allies are immune to all damage and effects throughout the duration of this ability. And this can be pretty huge, because if you're positioned nicely, you can actually completely negate whole AoE ultimates of your enemies for just 25 energy. And so that's all her abilities listed and explained to you one by one. And so we can now move on to Jade's playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. To me, Jade has a very fun and also enjoyable playstyle because of the nature of her abilities. Because her most damaging abilities require her to cast for a bit, and she must remain stationary while casting, her playstyle involves a lot of maneuvering and weaving in and out of combat to try to get those nice snipes and ultimates in on the enemies. As I've mentioned earlier about her right click ability, Snipe, being her main damaging ability, her playstyle should heavily revolve around effectively maximizing the damage on the enemies with Snipe. You don't want to be too near to enemies where they can easily interrupt or damage you significantly while trying to cast your Snipe, and at the same time you also don't want to be too far away from enemies, that it becomes so much harder to hit them with Snipe since you need to lead your targets a little bit when sniping them. So you need to have this fine balance between being too near or too far to your enemies to properly make use of your Snipe ability. So proper use of Blast Vault, which is Jade's spacebar ability, as well as her stealth ability Q, will help tremendously when trying to get those nice snipes off on your enemies. And so here are some of my tips to get the most out of Blast Vault. Blast Vault is actually best used when trying to get away from melee champions who have somehow managed to get close to you. Since you damage them and get away from them at the same time, it's actually a win-win situation. You can follow this up with a snipe, and this can be quite powerful as well, because it might be harder for them to reach you at that point after you blast vaulted away from them. You can also use Blast Vault as an evasive maneuver. Just before an ability goes off on top of you, you can use Blast Vault to avoid it completely. And this is especially useful for times when you can't run out of the AoE in time, and so you just have no choice but to use spacebar to get out of it. Sometimes, during 2v1 or 3v1 situations, whether it be that some of the enemies have died or just due to their bad positioning, you can actually use Blast Vault to get closer to the lone enemy, allowing for easier hits from your damaging abilities like Snipe or even your ultimate, and maybe quickly get a pick off this way. Do be careful though when doing this, because Blast Vault has a 9-second cooldown and you are very vulnerable when Blast Vault is on cooldown, so it is actually best to try to get the hang of the cooldown of this ability, because that way you know when to engage on or to disengage from your enemies. Using stealth as an escape mechanism, however, is a little trickier, I feel. Against ranged opponents, it's actually not too bad, but it isn't as optimal when using it when a melee champion is already onto you and Blast Vault is on cooldown. Since stealth doesn't really make you invulnerable for a short time, the melee enemy can still fairly easily damage you, which isn't really what you want from an escape ability. But if you do have enough energy, you can use Smoke Veil, which is the EX version of stealth, to get away more easily. I find that her Q ability stealth is often better used as an initiation ability rather than an escape ability. Casting your snipe ability while in stealth actually doesn't break stealth, and so getting into a good position while using stealth and then casting your snipe often makes it hard for people to expect where it is coming from, even though they still receive the audio cue that you are casting snipe. It could also be quite effective to use this same tactic with Jade's ultimate, since it is also a channeling ability, and this will make it much harder for the enemy to interrupt your ultimate. I feel that what I've just mentioned about Jade is a playstyle in a nutshell. Whenever you're not trying to set up a nice snipe or ultimate, you'll be moving about, baiting their cooldowns while poking or damaging enemies with your left click ability. And proper management of the cooldowns of your right click, Q and spacebar abilities is essential to being a good Jade player, I feel. And so from this, we can see that her strength lies in her burst damage potential, and she is fairly simple to play, since the biggest skill factor involved in playing Jade is aiming her skill shots as well as managing her cooldowns. No buffs or debuffs etc. on allies and enemies that you have to really worry about. She is also incredibly satisfying to play, since landing those long range snipes actually feels super awesome as well. Her weaknesses, however, is that her damaging abilities require you to stand still and have good aim, and this makes it so much harder to use her effectively against highly experienced enemies. And so because of this, she needs setups by her allies to effectively deal damage against experienced enemies. Even though it seems she has a lot of escape options too, I feel that she is sometimes too over-reliant on Blast Vault, and she is at her most vulnerable state when Blast Vault is on cooldown. Moving on, let's take a look at Jade's Battlerites, and see how each Battlite can help change up her playstyle or help her against her enemies. Because there are so many Battlerites, reading through all of that will make this already long video even longer. So I won't be doing that, but you can pause the video now to quickly read through each of the Battlerites if you want, and then I will go through those that I feel is worth mentioning and commenting on. Okay, now that you've done looking through the Battlerites, let's continue. In the first tier, I think Ambush is the best choice in most cases because it just allows you to have so much more burst damage with essentially all the free snipes. And this is especially true if you have a melee ally to distract your enemies for you. I feel Outlaw and Cheap Shot are a bit more situational and also more dependent on other factors. And by other factors, I mean like synergies with your teammates or your own Battleright choices in the next tiers. You will be passing up on a lot of potential damage from Ambush if you pick any of the other two. On to the second tier, I think this tier is one of the key tiers for Jade because every choice is pretty good on their own, and they all allow you to vary up your playstyle a little bit. If I pick Ambush in the first tier, and that is the case for most of my games, Through the Shadows is a pretty solid pick, because that haste bonus allows you to quickly reposition and start casting that bonus snipe faster. Concussion Bomb is very good when your enemy team has a strong melee player, because that stun duration will help that little bit more against them. And if you don't feel the need for Through the Shadows or Concussion Bomb, Desperado is actually a pretty good Battleright to have too for some of that free left click damage. Who doesn't like free stuff anyways? One thing to consider is that if you know that you want to pick Desperado, perhaps because you know you won't need the other two Battlerites, this might justify picking Cheap Shot in the first tier. Since you'll be getting a lot of free hits in while your enemy is rooted, this is actually a pretty good combo. But if you still prefer Ambush over Cheap Shot in the first tier, Desperado is still a good pick even without the combo. After all, Desperado used to give you 12 ammo instead of 10 ammo before it got nerfed in the recent patch. In the third tier, I think Deadly Focus will be your main go-to Battleright for this tier most of the time, especially if you know that you've been hitting your snipes on your enemies. 6 extra bonus is huge in this game. About Black Powder, Junk Shot isn't that great in my opinion, but if the skill fits your playstyle with Jade, maybe you like to get really up close and personal with the enemy, or if the enemy melee player is really sticking to you, then maybe Black Powder can work. And finally, Delight, I think is just okay. It's not very often that you get successful disabling shots off, and even if you do, it is the only form of healing you'll get from your abilities alone, and I think you're probably better off trying to kill them faster while controlling the ops on the map than to rely on healing from disabling shots. On the tier 4 Battlerites, I believe that most of the time, Gunslinger would be the way to go. Agility just isn't good enough in my opinion, because Jade is already quite mobile herself and 10% is not that much. Slayer can be good, but if you struggle to get your enemies down to 30% to begin with, it's pretty much useless most of the time, and isn't going to help you win that crucial round, I feel. Gunslinger, however, it synergizes with Ambush, since more stealths get you more free snipes that way. It synergizes with Desperado too, more shots means even more stealth. Not to mention, boosting Ambush or Desperado means boosting whatever else that benefits from those spells. So all in all, it is a very solid Battleright pick, I must say. And finally, the 5th and final tier, I typically like Sovereign more than Shrapnel, since you got to be standing still to cast your ultimate. The 75% reduced damage is huge and really helps you to survive, and not worry as much about your vulnerable state that you're in while you're trying to take down that key target with your ultimate. Shrapnel could work, I suppose, if maybe your opponents are bad at handling their escape cooldowns, taking advantage of their escape ability being on cooldown and unleashing your ultimate on them with Shrapnel effect could be pretty good, I guess. But I usually tend to prefer Sovereign more anyways, since the longer you survive, the better your chances are at winning. And so that's it for the Battleright section, and now let's move on to some of my tips and combos for Jade that I have for you. My first tip for you as Jade is good positioning. With so many abilities that require you to channel, her effectiveness is severely reduced when caught out of position, and so you definitely do not want to let that happen. try to always be at a medium distance from your enemy whenever possible, where you can still hit them with your left click ability, and try not to let people get too close to you while in a tight corner. I find that a good rule of thumb for positioning for Jade is to make sure that you have Blast Ward ready when you expect to be in cramped spaces. Being in cramped spaces will very easily get you caught out of position, and when you do, will get you damaged quite a lot or killed. Stealth, as you know, doesn't negate damage and so would unlikely get you out, and so you can only really rely on Blast Ward to get you out of sticky situations. I typically like to start the round being near the edges of the center and snipe people from there. If I'm chased, I'll start to run back out toward the sides since I would have Blast Ward ready at the start usually. Even though fighting your enemies in cramped spaces is disadvantageous, just be careful and be ready to jump out at any time. Finally, when I really need to jump, I jump back toward the center, just about in time for the central orb to be ready, so that's what I typically like to do at the start. Another tip I have for you is when you choose Ambush, that Battlerites in the first tier which allows you to cast Snipe again after you use Stealth, you can afford to be more aggressive with your Stealth. Especially if you see the lone support preoccupied with something else while being a bit of a distance away from her ally or allies, for example. Fully casting your Snipe and then quickly stealthing to get closer and casting Snipe again will usually catch them by surprise if they are not paying attention. If things turn out well and both snipes connect, that poor person will almost be at half health already. But of course, before any aggressive moves, you must always remember to have a backup plan, and that is Blast Ward. I feel I repeated the word Blast Ward so many times this video already, but I can't stress it enough how important the ability is for her survival. A good tip for Jade, and in fact ranged champions in general, is to kite. Kiting is when you would attack an enemy while backing away at the same time, essentially making the enemy try to chase you while you're firing away at them. All ranged champions in Battlerites can do this, while some do it better than others. It is a necessary skill in playing any ranged champion. Finally, my last tip I have for you is to mess with your opponents with your snipe cast. Cancelling your snipe mid-cast sometimes to confuse them is one way, but another way is to also aim your snipe at one player, but flick it to another enemy instead so that they won't expect it coming. This of course depends on the situation, and it takes a lot of practice to use it in the right situations and times, so I wouldn't expect you to immediately be good at this. Even I haven't really gotten used to doing this properly yet, but maybe one day. This is of course not everything you need to know, but are just some of the more important ones I feel. Going through every single little thing would take a long time, so I think these should be sufficient for this video. In terms of teammates that go well with Jade, I feel that in 2v2s, games are easier when you pair Jade with a melee ally, because I feel that you just have a little bit more room to breathe when having a melee ally draw attention away from you. This is especially true with melee allies that can petrify or incapacitate an enemy, not only for creating room to breathe, but also for easy snipes and free damage. Melee champions that work well with Jade are Crook, Shifu, Bako, just to name a few. That is not saying that Jade shouldn't be paired with supports, but it's just my personal preference for having a melee teammate. But if I were to have a support teammate, I tend to prefer supports that can provide shields or immaterials like Lucy, Pearl, and maybe Paloma when playing as Jade, especially for moments when I need some protection while casting an ability or so on. In 3v3s, I think team composition isn't nearly as important as 2v2, but I think it still helps to have a good balanced comp. Most comps probably have their counters, and so I believe being able to react properly to whatever is going on in the arena, basically having good mechanical skills, will likely to win you more games here, but that's just my opinion. And so yeah, that's all I have to say for my Jade guide, and I hope you found it useful. I'm already working on my next Battlerites champion guide, which should be a Pearl guide. If you want to, I have set up a poll which you can access by clicking the I button at the top right of the video, where you can vote for which guide I will make after Pearl. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed what you watched, please do like, comment, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. I'll greatly appreciate all of your support. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.